Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. In this episode, I wanted to address the subject of the Apostle Paul. Now, I remember back in 1970, late 1970, when I entered the Bahá'í faith, I heard a lot of negative things about him. I will not get into detail on that. I'll just leave it at that. A lot of negative things about the Apostle Paul. I love Paul, and I think that Paul is widely misunderstood, especially within some of the different branches of Christianity, but also more broadly than that. I remember one time I was in a Muslim chat room on the Paltalk chat system, and I mentioned Paul, and I was immediately criticized by some people in the room. And at that point, I said, well, do you know that Muhammad in Islam is called the Apostle of God or the Messenger of God, in Arabic, Rasul, and the Apostle Paul can also be called the Messenger Paul. So Paul, I think, could be seen as a Rasul as well. And that person obviously did not agree with me. But to me, that is very, very significant because to me, Paul makes sense out of Christianity. But sadly, the church fathers twisted Paul and turned him into a distortion of himself, almost a satire of himself, I would say. Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, said some rather disparaging things about the church fathers, that the church fathers essentially twisted the religion of Christianity. Systematic theology twisted the religion of Christianity, and that is what the church fathers developed. In other words, they took the epistles of Paul and they transformed them into a kind of systematic theology. Now, I know there is debate about whether certain of the epistles attributed to Paul were actually written by Paul. And I do not know enough about that to comment. I will accept that. Maybe that is true. Maybe some of the epistles are not genuine, some are. I have no idea. I was not there when they were written, so I can't testify to that. And I am not a biblical scholar. I can read basic Koine or Common Greek, but that's about it. That is not enough. That does not make me a biblical scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But what Paul did is he took the gospel of Christ, in my view, and he contextualized it to the Ephesians, to the Galatians, to the Philippians, to the Corinthians, and so on. He demonstrated that the gospel of Christ could be applied differently in different communities. There was no systematic theology. There was a theology that left room for multiplicity, for diversity, for variety, meaning the teachings of Christ or the gospel could be applied in very different ways in different parts of the world. So I think that the lesson that Paul, who in my view was an apostle of God, a messenger of God, as he himself referred to himself, was basically establishing Christianity on a much different foundation than what the church fathers did and what the first and second councils of Nicaea, which were largely based on the ideas of the church fathers, did. really they ended up distorting, in my view, the teachings of Christ. And that is very, very sad. Wars were fought, horrible wars between Roman Catholics and Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox. Many people died needlessly fighting battles over proper definitions of the Trinity. The Trinity was a dogma or doctrine which arose as a result of systematic theology. As the church fathers tried to reconcile these different epistles of Paul, they found that the Trinity was one way to produce a kind of reconciliation. But nowhere in the writings of Paul does Paul ever say, you need to take my epistles and universalize them and reconcile them. No, he was writing to different congregations with their own needs. Perhaps the most needy congregation was in Corinth. They had a lot of problems, and so Paul actually wrote to them at least 2 epistles. Well, 2 that we have. And he spent a lot of time trying to correct them, to make their services more organized. He explained, do this, do this, do this, because apparently they really had no idea of what they were doing. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of fighting, infighting, and Paul spent a lot of time, a lot of loving care in dealing with them. Like all the messengers of God, Paul had a vision. He had a vision of angels while on a boat with other prisoners. While on the road to Damascus, the Damascus highway, he had a vision of Christ, which led to his acceptance, to his emergence as Paul from Saul. He was Saul, but as Saul, he had persecuted Christians. As Paul, he became the champion of Christians. So, although he called himself an apostle, a messenger, he was not one of the 12 apostles. Some people who do not like Paul have taken that and interpreted it to mean that Paul was an interloper. He claimed to be something he was not. Paul had already established himself as an apostle, but there were already apostles before him. And those were the apostles that were selected by Christ. So many people who do not like Paul have said, what right did Paul have to emerge and say, I am an apostle? I am a messenger, or in Arabic, I am a rasul. He had no right at all. He was basically stealing the name, as some people have argued. In my view, nothing could be further from the truth. Without Paul, there is no Christianity. Or without Paul, I guess you could say, there is a Christianity of sorts, but it is a Christianity of schism and Christianity of conflict, a Christianity of dissension. And in fact, that is the way Christianity has been basically since it started. And again, I think that is primarily because of a misunderstanding of Paul. If Paul had been properly understood, if an acceptance of diversity, of multiplicity was accepted by Christians, then Christians would have embraced tolerance, tolerance in doctrine, tolerance in viewpoints, tolerance in understandings, tolerance in relationships and ways of relating to each other. Paul was a hero of that. Without Paul, there is nothing. And so, to me, Paul although he was, in my view, a lesser prophet to Christ, the term lesser or minor prophet, I think, can be easily confused. He is a prophet who was not endowed with constancy, to use the more common Baha'i term, meaning he was not a lawgiver, but he was still a messenger of God, an apostle of God, like Christ, like Muhammad, like Moses, like Baha'u'llah, like the Bab, and all the other great prophets and messengers of God. And so I think that Paul and his position should perhaps be reconsidered. That is my suggestion. I think that we should engage with Paul's heart. Establish a kind of intersubjective relationship with Paul. Maybe pray to Paul. Connect with his heart, his soul, and his mind. That is what I have done. As a result of having done that, I can truly say that I love Paul. Perhaps I love Paul more than any other prophet except the Bab and Baha'u'llah. I think that is a fair statement to make. I love all the prophets of God, all the messengers of God, but Paul holds a very special place in my heart because I know what he did. Paul offers us a solution to dealing with dissenting views, namely, that we accept them. We do not all have to think alike. We can all express our own understandings, making it clear that we are only expressing our own understandings. We are not all required to conform to some kind of systematic theology. We can believe things based upon what we read, what we study, what we pray, how we meditate. We are not required to all think the same way. We are not. Nor should we. It is better, in my view, if we all have different approaches to things, to let 1,000 flowers bloom, as the saying goes, and to see where that leads, to follow the path of Paul, the path of tolerance, the path of steadfastness. Paul, I think, had to be the man he was in order to become as tolerant as he was. He had to go through a period of being an enemy of Christians outwardly in order to really understand who he was fighting, to have that experience of conflict, seeing that conflict, experiencing it, being a source of conflict himself, so that when he was finally awakened to his prophethood by Jesus and by angels, that he was prepared for his mission, a mission of teaching the gospel, of spreading the gospel. So Paul was both a messenger or an apostle of God and an evangelist. Paul was the master evangelist. Sadly, as I've said, I think that the Christianities, in plural, have taken a wrong turn. And that wrong turn began with the church fathers, which is why I think Shoghi Effendi was not a particular fan of the church fathers. Instead, we need, I think, when understanding Christianity, to focus on the message of Paul and on Paul's unique contributions to the development of the religion of God. Because Paul is the mirror of Christ. Paul is the heart of Christ. And that, I think, is why we should all love him. I sometimes will tell people that I adore him. I will use that word adore. And people are often surprised because they know I'm not a Christian. And a lot of people who are not Christians, but who love Christ, see Paul as an enemy of Christ. They say, well, I like the Gospels, but I don't like the epistles of Paul. Again, they are buying into what the church fathers did, how the church fathers took the epistles of Paul and tried to reconcile them. No, that, in my opinion, was the mistake. You don't reconcile contextualizations. You appreciate them. You accept them. You respect them. You love them. And you take them as an example, as illustrations of how perhaps you can take that same gospel and contextualize it within your own community. So, in that sense, Paul could perhaps be seen as a kind of exemplar, a messenger of God who exemplified what Christians should have done, in my view, speaking as somebody who has never been a Christian, somebody who comes from a Jewish background, but nevertheless, someone who adores Paul more than almost any other being in the world. When I die, which I don't think will be too long from now, I mean, after all, I'm almost 69 years old. Well, relatively near 69 years old. I won't be around that much longer. The person, the being that I would like to meet first, to be perfectly honest, is Paul. I want to meet Paul. I don't know what hugging is in the next world, or if there is something analogous to it. I assume there is, but I don't know what that is. But I would like to embrace, to hug Paul, to share my affection for him. I'm sure that Paul knows of my affection, but I want to converse with him spiritually, to have that experience of an encounter with the great, the magnificent messenger of God, Saint Paul. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.